Go.
What a wonderful occasion to be able to talk with you, comrades, on the opposite side of the world and exchange ideas about a great event that took place exactly 100 years ago today. And I'm going to tell a story in this short introduction about how the outcome of the Russian Revolution was influenced by a slogan, "All power to the Soviets." But before beginning, I want to acknowledge my debt to four historians whose recent writing has been of great help in preparing this: China Mieville, Paul LeBlanc, Eric Blanc, and Lars Lee. And so let us go back to Russia a little more than 100 years ago, to its capital, Petrograd, on a gray and hungry February, still locked in winter, where people's hearts were suddenly inspired with new hope. On February 27, 1917, the ancient Russian Empire of the Tsars collapsed, overthrown by an uprising of workers and soldiers. Across the city, the rebel masses sealed off the last strongholds of the monarchist police and celebrated their great victory. Meanwhile, two small groups of worried politicians gathered at the opposite ends of the Tauride Palace, the seat of the Duma, or Consultative Parliament. Russia no longer had a government. What was to be done? In the right-hand wing of the Tauride Palace, a self-appointed group of concerned deputies, liberal critics of the former Tsar, concluded that they must form a government. But how? They had no mandate. And actually, one of the Tsar's last actions had been to dissolve the Duma, depriving them of official status. And all the instruments of power, guns, telephone lines, trains, and above all, moral authority, now rested in the hands of the insurgents thronging in the streets. In the other wing of the Tauride, a group of moderate socialists, some recently sprung from jail, moved to claim the leadership of the mass movement swirling in the streets. They convened a meeting of as yet non-existent Petrograd Workers' Council. Now, the Russian word for council is Soviet, to be held that evening. The appeal drew on memories of the renowned Soviet of 1905, a rank-and-file assembly leading a general strike forcibly dispersed by the Tsar. Word went out to the factories and regiments to send delegates at once, and that evening the noble and gilded corridors of the Tauride filled with hundreds of shabby-looking and exhausted workers and soldiers. Amid excitement and confusion, they met and talked and took decisions for a workers' militia to replace the police, for a food structure to assure supply, for a permanent structure of the Soviet, a presiding committee, and an executive to which it would report. The Soviet also issued its famous Order Number 1 to the army, which said that soldiers now had civil rights in view with respect to their officers, in fact, that they would elect the officers. Already the Soviet possessed the key attributes of government, of power. It had a mission to democratize the country, moral authority, and it had the armed strength to enforce its decisions. But when the Soviet Executive Committee met the following day, its moderate socialist leaders, mostly from the Mensheviks or Socialist Revolutionary, that is, SR parties, were determined to vest power in the unelected Duma deputies. A minority made up of the Bolsheviks and other left currents saw no need of this, and they called for a provisional revolutionary government of forces in the Soviet, excluding the Duma liberals. But the moderates prevailed and gave the Duma group a Soviet mandate to set up a government of capitalist politicians, subject in theory to Soviet supervision. The two institutions born of these meetings, the Soviets and the Provisional Government, dominated Russian political life until the Soviets' triumph in the October Revolution. Their coexistence was termed dvovlastye, or dual power, which in Russian is not a complimentary term. The Russian word for power implies sovereign authority, so dual power signifies a bizarre and self-contradictory situation. Now, this curious outcome flowed from a debate on doctrine among Russian socialists based on conflicting readings of the country's unsuccessful revolution back in 1905. Now, all the socialists agreed on some points. The driving forces in a coming upheaval would be the workers and the peasants. They agreed. And that this thrust was toward what they called a democratic, or if you will, bourgeois democratic revolution, abolition of czarist tyranny, establishment of a democratic republic, equal civil rights for all, a radical land reform, and the like. The limiting factor in this revolution, they believed, was the peasantry, which made up the vast majority of the population and was mostly still locked in feudal or pre-feudal productive relations. The socialists believed that few peasant proprietors were going to be easily won to socialism. The road to socialism would be open only when capitalist relations became dominant in agriculture and most peasant smallholders had been converted into capitalist farmers or rural wage workers or urban proletarians. And that was unlikely to change unless socialism triumphed in the industrialized countries in Europe. So hold that thought because it comes up a few lines further down. Now, as I said, these points were broadly agreed. The more moderate socialists, including most of those in the Menshevik current, concluded from this that when Tsarism fell, the Russian Revolution would be carried out by an alliance of workers with capitalist forces, the bourgeoisie, and would need to establish a provisional government under bourgeois leadership, which you recall is precisely what they did on that momentous day in 1917. The Bolsheviks and other radical socialists had a different vision. They felt the bourgeoisie was sure to resist rather than lead such a democratic revolution. The alternative was an alliance of workers and peasants, a winning formula to democratically establish their own revolutionary government independent of the bourgeoisie. And that was the motion of the minority in that meeting in the Taurid. The worker-peasant government would drive through to the end achievement of all the demands possible within the existing capitalist framework. The influential independent socialist Leon Trotsky had a slightly different prognosis, but in 1917 his views converged with the Bolsheviks, and he joined them soon after his return to Petrograd in May. However, by 1917 something had changed, and that was the World War that broke out 3 years earlier. The Bolsheviks, in light of the World War, modified their strategy. The war, they believed, put socialist revolution on the agenda across Europe in the warring countries. In keeping with the resolutions of the pre-war Socialist International, the Bolsheviks and their allies in the West sought to utilize the crisis of the war to hasten that revolution. Overthrow of the Russian Revolution would be a big stride in that direction. And if the war led to the triumph of socialism in the West, that would create the conditions in which a ready transition to socialism could be made in Russia as well. When the revolution came to Russia in 1917, however, it had an unexpected and totally paradoxical result. The two counterposed outcomes, bourgeois government and worker-peasant government, were both realized simultaneously in the same place. The Soviet structure soon spread and extended across the Tsarist Empire and into rural areas, and was the embryo of a worker-peasant government, but the moderate socialists had thrust power on bourgeois politicians who had done nothing for the revolution, but aimed to reap its rewards. The provisional government was inherently much weaker than the Soviets, but was sustained by the Menshevik and their friends who were then leading the Soviets. Still, in the early days, the new freedom was universally celebrated. Trotsky later wrote of raptures, embraces, and joyous tears. The new government was treading carefully, gaining respect by proclaiming some of the new freedoms demanded by the Soviets. The Bolsheviks also stepped cautiously, many say too cautiously, in the new terrain. As a party with mass influence, it had to avoid rash calls to action that might isolate vanguard workers and spark disastrous armed confrontations. Writing in mid-March, 2 weeks after the events I just described, Bolshevik leader Lev Kamenev expressed party strategy in carefully chosen words. The bourgeoisie will inevitably attempt to halt the revolutionary movement. It will not permit it to satisfy the essential needs of the proletariat and peasantry. These needs can be met only when power in all its plenitude is in their own hands. It will come to this, to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. Now, by dictatorship, Kamenev was referring to a form of emergency rule which is compatible with mass democracy. The notion of worker-peasant power is clearly stated, but there's a weakness in this statement. It's 100 words long. It won't fit on a banner. As the days grew longer and warmer, working people became more impatient with the provisional government. It was stalling on land reform and convocation of a constituent assembly, and above all, it was doing nothing to extract Russia from the ruinous war, which had taken the lives of millions of soldiers, ruined agriculture and the economy, created critical food shortages, and raised the specter of famine. Rank-and-file pressure grew to resolve the problem of non-functional dual power. As Trotsky later wrote, alienation from the provisional government embraced not only workers and locally garrisoned soldiers, but all the many-colored small people of the towns, mechanics, street peddlers, petty officials, cab drivers, janitors, and servants of all kind. And he continued, the masses poured into the Soviet as through the triumphal gates of the revolution. All that remained outside of the Soviet seemed to fall away from the revolution. Beyond the boundaries of the Soviet remained the world of the property owner. A U.S. writer on the spot at that time, Albert Rees Williams, later recalled that the Soviets, quote, have drawn to themselves the vital forces in each community. They have been schools for the training of the people, giving them confidence. In many ways, he said, they were already acting as a government. Historian China Mieville provides a couple of examples of that. On March 10, the Petrograd Soviet won agreement from local employers to institute the 8-hour day, long a central demand of workers. But in fact, many workers had already instituted the 8-hour day absolutely on their own by refusing to work longer. Recalcitrant foremen were thrown in wheelbarrows, that is, trundled down to the local canal and dumped into it. In Moscow, where the bosses refused to grant the 8-hour day, the local Soviet simply imposed it by a decree, bypassing the provisional government, and the decree stood. The network of Soviets spilled out into the small towns and countryside. Village assemblies were held to debate the next steps of the revolution. And as the impulse for self-government spread, committees were formed at every level and for every task. Populations long silent in servitude raised their voices. In early May, for example, 900 Muslim delegates from every part of Russia, a quarter of them women, met in conference in Moscow to debate their future. The conference called for their communities to receive cultural autonomy, a first step in their thinking towards the idea of liberation. On April 4, Lenin returned to Russia from exile and presented the Bolsheviks with a series of proposals called the April Theses. They sparked a debate in the Bolshevik Party whose meaning is even today in dispute among socialist historians. A number of relevant studies are posted on my personal website. Have a look. You'll get a close-up view of how the Bolshevik Party actually functioned, how its central leaders related among themselves and to the branch organizers and to the broader mass of workers who took part in their activities. I think you'll find some points of similarity with the Socialist Alliance. So what was at issue in this debate? Many socialist historians, including Trotsky, have held that the April discussion led the Bolsheviks to a sharp change of course away from accommodation with the provisional government toward a campaign for Soviet power. Some maintain that this initial wrong position flowed from a flaw in the Bolshevik strategy going back to 1905. Now, recently, a different viewpoint has emerged holding that Bolshevik strategy was actually consistent right through, and the adjustment in April was on secondary and tactical questions. Now, this newer interpretation is presented by Lars Lee and Eric Blanc in articles on my website, and I share this view. We three of us came to this opinion independently of each other, and we do not agree on all points. In the April 1917 discussion, Lenin called for a forceful campaign for the Soviets to resume power, and that was in step with the course of events, and it was generally agreed. And it was done. There were an array of other questions that were resolved through discussion, such as, for example, Lenin's initial insistence that workers should not place demands on the provisional government, such as publications of their secret treaties for annexation at the end of the war. A key point on which all agreed was the need for the worker-peasant government to come into being independent of the capitalist class. It was also agreed, and Lenin insisted on this point, that the campaign for a Soviet power must be one of patient explanation, while avoiding premature confrontation. But nowhere in all this do we find the slogan, "All power to the Soviets," which is the theme of my talk. So we have a problem here. The thought was there, but not the slogan. So where did the slogan come from? What do you think? Later that month, the provisional government reaffirmed its loyalty to the Allies' war of conquest There was a wave of protest against this in Petrograd, against the war and against the government. Such marches in 1917 displayed a forest of hand-lettered banners. It was a sign of the revolution's vitality, and on April the 21st, an unknown Bolshevik activist brought a sign he or she had made that displayed 3 words: Все власть Советам. All power to the Soviets. Now, the sign was noticed by a reporter from Pravda, the Bolshevik paper, who mentioned it somewhere in his news report. Lenin saw it and called attention to the slogan in an article he published a few days later. And a few days later again, the Bolsheviks in early May issued a programmatic statement built around the slogan. The statement was extremely simple. It went through the list of problems, the various dilemmas facing the country, and argued in each case that each and every problem had a simple solution: all power to the Soviets. The slogan used a strong word for power, vlast, meaning sovereign authority, as I said, and the armed strength to back it up. Все, that is all, meant no more new power. The provisional government must step aside. And Sovietum lodged the power in the hands of the country's only mass democratic representative institution, one familiar to all. Indeed, by June, the Soviets had 37 million members. And the slogan was only 16 letters long. Think of it, short enough to fit on the banner in a single line. Well, in May and June, the slogan caught on and won wide support. But it had an obvious weakness. The Mensheviks and the SRs leading the Soviet rejected it, still refusing to accept governmental responsibility. The provisional government balked at radical measures, and so the revolution seemed stalled. Reactionary forces were regaining confidence, aiming at a right-wing military takeover that could drown the revolution in blood. Early in July, despite Bolshevik calls for patience, the anger of the Petrograd workers and soldiers boiled over. The call, all power to the Soviets, was taken up by armed rallies and armed marches in which the Bolsheviks reluctantly took the lead. Workers were then attacked by forces loyal to the provisional government, and once again the streets of Petrograd rang out with the sound of battle. Hundreds of protesters were killed in these attacks, and hundreds more were arrested. And when the fighting ended, the government launched a slander campaign against the Bolsheviks while driving the party underground. Trotsky and other leaders were jailed. Lenin was forced into hiding. From his refuge in nearby Finland, Lenin then proposed to drop the slogan, "All power to the Soviets." It was now wholly compromised by the moderate Soviet leaders' support for right-wing violence and repression, he said. Another road must be found. The Bolsheviks adopted Lenin's position, although Eric Blanc points out that it was not actually carried out by most of the party branches. And then, within a few days, suddenly the situation was transformed once again. Alexander Kerensky, the new head of the provincial government, was in negotiations with a right-wing general by the name of Kornilov, with the goal of occupying Petrograd with right-wing military detachments and suppressing the radical workers and suppressing the Soviets. But Kerensky, himself a socialist of sorts, concluded that Kornilov intended to betray him and shove him aside. Kerensky deposed the general. Kornilov then rose in revolt, backed by a number of top army commanders. Kornilov sent army detachments to suppress the Soviets, topple Kerensky, and impose Kornilov as all-powerful dictator. Kerensky called for resistance. And the Bolsheviks? What should they do? What should they do? Should they block with the hated Kerensky, the man who had put Trotsky in jail and sent Lenin into exile? Their conclusion, definitely yes. The Bolsheviks joined with the moderates leading the Soviet to oppose the coup. Bolsheviks took the lead in mobilizing workers for the city defenses, and pro-Soviet forces met Kornilov's troops, not with bullets, but with arguments. And I give you an example. Kornilov had what he called the Savage Division. He used that word because they were from Asia. An elite unit of Muslim troops which he sent against Petrograd. It was met along the way by a delegation from the Union of Muslim Soviets, including the grandson of the great Imam Shamil, the legendary hero of resistance to 19th century Tsarist conquest. The soldiers welcomed their visitors, and the night was spent in passionate and fraternal discussion. And through such initiatives, the revolt collapsed. During the workers' and soldiers' mobilization against Kornilov, the demand, all power to the Soviets, was reasserted in various places and in various ways by workers' assemblies and also by Anatoly Lunacharsky speaking for the Bolsheviks. Workers experienced a surge of confidence which affected the moderate socialists as well. Kamenev for the Bolsheviks proposed to the Petrograd soldiers a motion for the government of workers and poor peasants only, to institute a radical land reform, workers' supervision of industry, and a democratic peace. You notice he makes a tactical reformulation of Soviet power. And this motion was adopted to astonishment by a 63% majority in the Soviet, including many left Mensheviks and SR votes. Seizing the opening, the Bolsheviks challenged the moderate socialists to form a Soviet government and said that if they did so, the Bolsheviks would tolerate this government while arguing for their views in the Soviets. Lenin said it was a chance, a long-shot chance, but nonetheless, for a peaceful transfer of power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks took a number of initiatives to press the moderates to agree, but it was all to no avail. The moderates, socialists, would not give up their block with Kerensky and the capitalist politicians. The months of September and October were marked by growing crisis, accompanied by mass labor and soldiers' struggles, growing lawlessness, and threats against the Soviets. The Bolsheviks gained a majority in the Soviets of the two main cities, Petrograd and Moscow, and in a growing number of provincial cities as well. They campaigned for a Russia-wide Soviet conference in late October that could authoritatively assume power. But to make that possible, the revolutionaries had to secure effective control of the city of Petrograd, where the Congress was to meet. To that end, the Soviets established a military arm, the Military Revolutionary Committee, to defend workers and soldiers against threats, whether from a German army attack, from right-wing militarists, or from Kerensky's forces. When Kerensky assembled armed contingents to secure his regime, the Soviet defense structure was already in place to head this off. The Soviet forces secured the bridges, opened the streets, and took the Winter Palace, the seat of government. The next day, 100 years ago today, the Soviet government Congress met and assumed power and appointed a government of people's commissars. Decrees followed quickly, addressing the main needs of the country: armistice and peace, land nationalization and distribution, provision of food, freedom of subject nationalities, and equality for women. All power to the Soviets was now a reality. And so that concludes our story, but not quite. Let's bring it up to the present day. In 1917, the new Soviet government soon experienced difficulties and setbacks. There were rightist revolts, there were foreign invasions, blockade, civil war, and the collapse of the Soviet governmental coalition, leaving the Bolsheviks to rule alone. The Soviet government survived and won the Civil War, but under the blows of isolation and misfortune, gradually and step by step, the regime hardened, a bureaucracy grew, and workers' democracy was transformed over many years into a bureaucratic tyranny headed by Joseph Stalin. Yet nonetheless, around the world, the inspiration of the October Revolution spread as proof that working people could form a government and rule a country, as a working example of how self-rule could function. Workers' councils were formed in other countries, never with the authority and staying power of those in Russia, and they did not achieve power. Nonetheless, the underlying idea of all power to the Soviets, of rule by the exploited and oppressed victims of capitalism, did spread and take root. Workers and farmers found other paths to ending capitalist rule in China, Vietnam, Cuba, and other countries. These revolutions fell short of the Russian example in many ways, yet in some respects, some of them were more successful. Today, the capitalist order, despite its achievements, faces existential challenges, beginning with the growing and urgent war danger, and also the looming ecological catastrophe. Capitalism cannot even address these challenges, let alone head them off. In our new century, the Russian Revolution provides an eloquent example of our capacity as producers and creators to join in forging a new future. So, all power to the Soviets. It is not a blueprint, but it is a vital link in a chain of memory of struggles by working people that shaped our present world. We today are utilizing a centenary, a historic victory exactly a century ago, to help us better understand, recover, and expand our memory of the heritage of ideas and experiences bound up in our movement. Capitalist society tends to stifle and obliterate memories of our struggles. As best we can, we try to reclaim this reclaim this memory and pass it on to a new generation to weigh and assess. the hopes and efforts of our revolutionary predecessors come alive again in us and find expression in our movements. In this sense, the 100-year-old slogan, "All power to the Soviets," will be a part of our future victories. Thank you very much.